Good evening, good evening, good evening. How is everyone? Good. I'm Lori Mertes. I'm the Director of Public Programs. And I'm thrilled that you're here with us tonight. We are here for our second program in our inaugural season of the Women, Arts, and Social Change Public Program Initiative. And thank you, Dan, for reminding me and putting that slide on. Our typefaces fell off, though, and we'll fix that later. So this is our second program. The first program happened a couple of weeks ago, and we had another beautiful audience and a lovely evening. But what's really exciting is how the conversation that we've started in this room continued downstairs at our Sunday supper, at our communal dinner, and continued again on social media, Facebook, Twitter. We had a Twitter chat with some of our speakers, and it's still going on. New relationships are built. Holly's one of our fantastic digital ambassadors out there in DC. It's really exciting to see, and that's really what we're here about. And so this is Women, Arts, and Social Change, is this new public program initiative that was really designed to take on the three core principles of this museum. The museum was founded on these principles, which are arts, women, and social action. And the idea is to create programs that can and will begin to make a difference. This program explicitly champions women through the arts. This program places the arts within a larger context of women's creativity and innovation. It situates arts and artists within a variety of disciplines, businesses, and peer groups, whose processes, experimentation, and risk-taking are like their own artistic practice. And these conversations and convenings are made even more meaningful by our location here in Washington, D.C. Why? The world's a mess. Why? Because when we bring to light the connections between artists and designers with these other disciplines, such as diverse as technology, the environment, architecture, social policy, social justice issues, gender issues, the work of these women and these creatives will be recognized as necessary rather than niceties. Mainstream versus marginal. Fresh Talk, the program you're here for today, is the signature program of this initiative. It brings together the potential of art and social activism to a wider audience, also those of you watching us live stream at home, and inspires a meaningful dialogue on ideas that can make a difference. As we said, the first program really addressed what we called the elephant in the room, talking about gender equality in the art world. And today we're coming back to another one of our first beginnings, which Susan Fisher-Stirling, our director, will talk about when she introduces Carrie, one of the very first exhibitions here in this museum. The program does not end here, it begins here. We have Sunday supper, which is a communal dinner served family style, and that is the place we really want you to reach out to your neighbors and talk to each other about the things you heard, the ideas that were sparked, and anything that comes to mind in terms of what can we do. One of the things that we do with this program is really pose the question, can we change it? Every single one of the Fresh Talk programs poses a question. And the idea is for not just our speakers, but you, the audience, to really talk about strategies for change, addressing these various issues that we bring up over the course of our ongoing program. We have some wonderful folks here today who are true visionaries. And I'm going to have you all stand up very quickly. Who are here in the room with your names on the wall, our donors. When this was just a nascent seed of an idea, these visionary leaders, donors, helped to support this program. So Denise, I see you there. Mary Lou, please stand up just for a moment so we can give you a round of applause. Anyone else who's here? Amy from RBC. The umbrella of this program also includes programs that we do on an ongoing basis. And so we're really thrilled because we're merging two of these aspects tonight. We do cultural capital sessions, which are the types of programs that are under the umbrella of Women, Arts, and Social Change, like working with the Environmental Film Festival, but also the March on Washington Film Festival, or the Women's Voices Theater Festival, which we were one of the kickoff venues and a venue for new plays by women. And so that's another aspect of the program. And we're really thrilled that Robert Raben can be here with us as one of our ongoing partners, but to bring this conversation into context with his work here in Washington, D.C. I'm going to turn things over in a moment to Amy Sturtevant, one of our visionary leadership donors, the presenting sponsor of this Fresh Talk with Carrie Mae Weems. But before we do that, I want to remind you all to silence your phones. Don't turn them off, though, because we want you to go tweet anything that sparks your imagination, put it out there in the world, and these are your various conduits by which you can do that. And so for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Amy Sturtevant. Thank you all.
Thanks, Lori, and hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. As you can see on the screen, and as Lori said, my name is Amy Sturtevant. I'm the branch director of RBC Wealth Management here in Washington, D.C. And we are so excited to be partnering tonight with the National Museum of Women in the Arts for this Fresh Talk program featuring Carrie Mae Weems, who I had a brief moment to meet her a little bit while ago, and you all are in for a real treat. She's great. By supporting programs like this that celebrate the achievements of women and excellence in the arts, RBC hopes to help foster communication, dialogue, and a greater appreciation for the role arts play in shaping our world. Through our partnership with the Women's Museum, we have the unique opportunity to share our support of women in the arts with our clients, friends, and community members. At RBC, diversity is at the core of everything we do. Our commitment to diversity for growth and innovation is all about people because our success is built on forming solid relationships. As a corporate steward, RBC is committed to helping advance women, not only in our business, but in the community, which is why we are so extremely proud to be a sponsor tonight. Carrie's art and activism are an inspiration for all of us. RBC Wealth Management is very committed to the communities where we do business. Our stewardship commitment extends beyond helping clients manage their wealth to something that we like to call the second golden rule. That is, leaving the world a better place than we found it. This deep sense of duty to our clients, communities, employees, and the environment is part of a larger corporate value system that drives every decision we make and guides every action we take. We believe that the arts are an essential part of a vital, well-rounded community, and that it is part of our corporate responsibility to encourage reflection and debate in our communities. On behalf of everyone at RBC, I'd like to give a final thank you to all of you for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the evening. And thanks for the opportunity for us today. Thanks.
Oh, I like my slide. Hi, I'm Susan Stirling. Ms. Weems is what she has always been, a superb image maker and a moral force, focused and irrepressible. Those are the words of Holland Cotter in the New York Times when Carrie had her recent retrospective at the Guggenheim. I had the privilege to work with Carrie on one of her earliest exhibitions, which was here at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. I experienced that moral force and that irrepressible energy for change even then. In fact, she changed my life. She's one of the people that made it real for me to work here all these years, 25 years later. And she really is the inspiration for this project. which is why I asked her to come to talk about Can an Artist Inspire Social Change? She's our keynote address. She will give our keynote address today. And I think what's incredibly important is that from whether it's her early work like Family Pictures and Stories, where she created a different narrative for Black families, very different from the Moynihan Report, all the way up to the work that she's doing today, which she'll talk about, including her work in Syracuse, New York. You see a thread of vision that very, very few artists can attain, but a standard that should be set for not only artists, but for us all in terms of how we operate in the world. I want to give Carrie the stage right away so that she can thrill you with what she's thinking about and working on, but I also want to challenge you when you talk at the Sunday supper not to go away without having a new idea in your head and a passion in your heart to do great things in the world. Carrie?
This is my remote. Hello. Hello. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Susan Stirling. Susan gave me my first major exhibition, and I'm surprised to hear that I changed your life. I know that you changed mine. And I thank you for that, for the opportunity to work with you, to learn some things about the work through you, to learn about you, to learn about this museum. To the other donors, thank you. Because I think, of course, there is only one National Women's Museum, and that's this one. It's sort of impressive, and it's extraordinarily important and vital and significant. You know, there are really only a few women in the history of art who have sold work on auction for over $1 million. In fact, there are only 7. There are only 7 out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of transactions that happen on a daily basis. So that there's a real space and a real place for what women in the arts is doing, that it's really vital. That it is a part of a dynamic and ongoing conversation. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you so much for inviting me. Is that Eunice? Is that Eunice Lipton out there? I think I see a great art historian in the audience, Eunice Lipton, who has made a significant contribution to the way in which we understand women and their role not only as artists, but their role as models in the world of fine art, which is very important. Her work, Alias Olympia, is an extraordinary book that I've read many times over and over again. And for those of you who don't know it, maybe you might want to check it out. I'm influenced by many people. And a part of the thing that I'm really most interested in is the way in which I'm influenced by other writers, by musicians, by other artists. And I'm not sure this is, maybe it's going this way, but my pointer doesn't seem to be actually working. Maybe I just need to press it in the center. That's the same slide. Okay, alrighty. You know, there are many people that have been important to me in my work and in my life. Toni Morrison, literature. Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon I read on my knees. I mean, I would read passages and I was so completely moved by what I had read that the only thing I could do was walk around in circles and drop down on my knees and say thank you, and read that passage over again to myself. And then there are people like, Laura Mulvey, who, before we go any further, how does this remote work? because we have lots to do. Okay. Okay. Oh, it has to be Is that right? Does it have to be pointed at the screen? Okay, so we'll give it a try. All righty. You know, there are people like Laura, who, again, set me on a certain kind of course because of what she was doing. You know, people like Tolstoy, who I read in my room when I was a young girl. I thought to myself, when I realized actually that I actually wasn't in Russia in the 18th, 19th century, that I wasn't like a horse, that I wasn't the wind, that I wasn't that hat on Anna's head, right, or the spurs on Brodsky's booth. When I realized that I was actually sitting in my room in Newhall, California as a student in Cal Arts, that's where I was, and not in any of those places or not any of those objects. The only thing that I could do was to put the book down and applaud to myself for about 5 minutes in my room, and I thought, this is actually what art has the power to do. That it really does actually have the power to transform your life. Reading Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens in relationship to Why There Have Been No Great Women Artists was absolutely important to me. Again, struggling to find my way, my path in this thing. Alice talks about being a mother or an artist in our grandmother's time, and she said, that story must be cruel enough to curl the blood. From people like Pina Bausch have taught me a great deal. And so I pay attention to what's going on in dance. I was just with Kyle Abraham yesterday, whose beautiful, beautiful group, Emotion, has been doing really important work. I listen a lot to music. I live in a world of sound. Music has saved my life. It has been the thing that has anchored my being in every conceivable way. And I love listening to certain renditions by many different artists at a time, so that on the one hand, I might spend a lot of time listening to Nina Simone's My Way, which I get up and I dance to in my studio often. And then I'll listen to Frank Sinatra's version of My Way, or Glenn Campbell's version of My Way. You know, that I am open to the possibilities of listening and learning what this possibility is. And then there have been extraordinary artists, photographers like the great Roy DeCarava, you know, Diane Arbus, Cameron, you know, Robert Frank, Gary Winogrand, Todd Papageorge. And there's a really great group of artists, have really taught me a great deal about the process of looking and the process of working. DeCarava, of course, was very, very important to me because of his sort of really beautiful understanding of dark light. The way in which there was an aesthetic value that one could actually use in the building and the making of photography. Or the sort of really beautiful first slow fade by Duchamp, who I think about often. Duchamp is somebody that I'm always considering in the work. Or somebody like Martin Furrier, and that sort of wonderful way in which he built sort of Jacob's Ladder. Or this really beautiful way in which Felix Gonzalez Torres insisted that he wanted his audience also to know something about what it meant to pass through life in this sort of amazing way as he was battling AIDS, that there was sort of gracious way of moving through those beams and those crystals, right? Forcing the audience to move back and forth across this amazing landscape of possibility as he was, descending deeper and deeper and deeper into his own death, his own demise. One of the most beautiful, beautiful and elegant ways, I think, that any artist has really, really spoken, I think, deeply about AIDS. Or the really wonderful Anna Mendieta, who also died much too soon, who tiptoed on eggshells and who used her body over and over and over and over and over again so that we could understand something important about the relationship of the body to nature, the body to the ground, the body to itself, and to the practice of art, that you have to use this skin, that you have to use this body in order to make a difference. Somebody like Adrian Piper, who decided that she would use her body painted occasionally black and then walk down the streets of Cambridge and Boston, brushing up against people, turning them black. And so this remote is really out of control. Maybe you guys can get this shit together. This is really annoying. Right? You work really hard on a lecture and it's like, ah. There's, this work by Doris Salcedo, who just finished her major retrospective at the Guggenheim, has been sort of amazing, really incredible. And we were just talking, Liana and I were just talking about this idea of the cracks, right? That, a part of, the reason that I'm here, the part of the reason that we're having this discussion about social change is because now all of the cracks, many of the cracks, for the first time in a major and significant way, have suddenly been revealed, right? The cracks are there, and we know that in one way or another that we have to take a stand in relationship to where all those cracks are, right? That we see them and that there is absolutely no place else to hide, that these cracks have to be looked at, that they have to be negotiated, that they have to be understood, right? But all around us are all of these extraordinary cracks. And we know now, in the late, early beginning of the 20th century, that there is no place really else for us to go than to figure out inventive and ingenious ways to deal with and to attempt to solve some of the most difficult problems that are facing us. We are, I think, in an amazing and extraordinary time. These ideas about influence, I think, have been important, and the way in which artists have really sort of negotiated these influences are also really important. The way in which women artists in particular, are negotiating these influences, I think, are really telling. Somebody like Lorna Simpson. And so I have to keep going. I just want to know how it works. And I don't know why that's a problem. This is like so rudimentary.
I think at this point, if you just want to ask for next, I'll advance it.
So why don't I do this? I'll just do this.
Okay, that sounds great.
Because doing
Thanks.
next is like really not appropriate. Okay, so these ideas about influence, the way in which, can we go back just a couple of slides? And one more. Okay. So I think about this sort of essay. There's a really beautiful book, actually. It's called Essay on Influence. It was written by Todd Papageorge, and he does it in relationship to, for those of you who are photographers, Walker Evans on the one hand, and Robert Frank on the other. Really, really beautiful book about this notion of influence and how influence actually works. But of course, all of us as artists, we are always influenced by other artists around us. None of us are existing on our own island, right? We are all in context and in relationship to somebody else. So that you have this sort of way in which somebody like Lorna Simpson interpolates and looks at somebody like Duchamp in order to build her relationship with modernism and with postmodernism. Or you have, this, of course, very, very famous painting. And then you have somebody like Micheline Thomas negotiating her space with modernism and bending it, being very inventive, creating whole new ways and metaphors for doing what she does. Of course, a really important painting by Colbert. And then, of course, I thought, I go to see this painting, this work by Duchamp often at the Museum of Modern Art, but I never thought about it in relationship to Colbert for a long time. Of course, this is one of the first times that the catalog that Susan put together for the project here at the National Women's Museum. The show toured for about 5 years. I've worked on many different kinds of projects coming out of the sort of notion of influence, and I've been influenced by any number of artists that I'm always thinking about. I work with lots of different artists. I collaborate poorly, but I do collaborate with other artists occasionally. You know? The Hampton Project, which we'll come back to, I think, maybe a little later on. And probably in some sort of way, you know, on the one hand, there's a sort of idea about influence and the importance of influence and the role of influence. And then, of course, there's something really important about the discovery of your own voice. You know, what that is in relationship to influence, but also standing outside of influence. And so when I was, 30 years old, and I'd done my stuff, right? I'd gone to graduate school. I love graduate school so much that I went twice. You know, once for photography and then once for folklore, because I love folklore. You know, and then, you know, so I was, you know, living in this little town and teaching, and I was working with a lot of young people, students. Laura Mulvey had just come out with this sort of seminal text on sort of this idea about the ways in which women have been objectified, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really important work. You know, and I was sort of like in the middle of that, and I was sort of thinking about the way in which all of my young students have been photographing themselves, the women in particular, that women photograph themselves in a fundamentally different way than men do. That women are always, and certainly, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, you know, that they were always sort of, you know, they were always sort of slightly hidden, right? You know, whether it's through hair or through clothing or through some way in which they are hidden. And men were always squaring themselves towards the camera, right? In a sort of very revelatory way. Women were always slightly veiled. The idea, the historical idea, I think, of the veil has been interesting. And so in the sort of process of working with my students, I began to really sort of think about, and thinking about these sort of critical texts, understanding the way in which, of course, historically, Black women had been dealt with was really not in the same way or the same vein at all. And that there was something that not only that I was interested in doing, something that I was interested in making, something that I had to know for me as an artist and as a woman, but also that I was engaged in this sort of, you know, important and critical practice at the same time, right? And that I wanted to sort of, you know, build a kind of light, a very simple light of illumination where certain kinds of emotions and ideas and situations were being constantly revealed, right? You know, that there's this relationship that we have with work, that there's a relationship that we have with family, that there's a relationship that we have with our girlfriends, that there's a relationship that we have with men, right? That there's a relationship that we have with our children, constantly sort of exploring these kinds of ideas and using this sort of very simple singular light, you know, which became sort of a metaphor for my own life, sort of this sort of spotlight on the situation was really sort of a really important way for me to work and for me to understand and for me to, in fact, sort of discover, you know, my own specificity and my own voice within the relationship of contemporary photography. And so I can remember being absolutely pained. Right? It was like, you know, a very, very painful time. You know, like being an artist is a very difficult thing to do, right? Because you're constantly living emotionally. You know, that you can feel it in your chest, you can feel it in your groin, you can feel it in your stomach, you can feel it in your head. I mean, you know, like, you know, I know that waking up to me, my husband finds somewhat difficult. I mean, you know, it's not all that easy waking up to my ass. I do know that. I do know that. You know? And so, you know, and so I'm, you know, I'm desperately trying to locate the center of myself, the center of my voice, the center of my being, and what that was. And every morning I would get up out of bed because I worked very hard, and I would go to my studio, and I would get up and I would cry all the way to my studio, and I would cry all the way to class, and then I would work with my students, and at the end of the day, I'd get back in my car and I would drive home and I would cry all the way home, back upstairs into my room, into my desk, to my computer. And this went on for a very long time. In the middle of that, I was listening to music, absolutely. It saved my life, it sustained me. And at the same time, I was really I was really trying to figure out what this center was, what this core was that was going to move me through the rest of my life. And one morning I got up, my best friend called me, and I answered the phone, with a voice that I had never heard before. And I remember putting down the phone. The voice was so odd, it was so strange that I put the phone down and I walked around my room. And then I realized that it had come from me. And not only had it come from me, but it had come from my mother, that I had my mother's voice. And I didn't cry for a very, 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 very long time after that. It was sort of like this incredible kind of revelation of coming to this moment, of coming to this point of understanding that I had had made a very, 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 very big circle in order to come back in a way to touchstone, to where I came from. And that the voice of authenticity was a voice that was really anchored in my past. That it wasn't floating out there somewhere, that it was really a part of who I was as a person and a part of a history, a part of a family, a part of a culture, a part of a tradition. And so Kitchen Table was this work that really came from this very deep place and was a really interesting project to work on, and working with other artists around it has been really important. One of the things that I really came to understand about myself in some way, maybe sort of crystallized in some sort of way, is that really, I'm really a woman who is fundamentally interested in social justice. I really don't care much about a lot of other things. I'm really interested in social justice and all the permutations that exist around that thing, how to negotiate that, and from, when and where you enter that platform is one thing, but that is the core of my concern, and that is the thing that sustains me day in and day out, is I think probably one of the most important things that I've come to understand about my own practice and about my own life and the way that my practice sort of intersects with my life. One of the things that becomes really important as an artist is that if you are really, really focused, if you're paying attention to what you do, that the work actually tells you what it needs, and it tells you what it needs to be, and that embedded within every single project is the beginning of the next project. And so I was working with Robert Colescott, who represented the United States for the Venice Biennale, asked me to make some photographs for him, and I knew that he actually didn't want a headshot. And so working with Robert Colescott really helped me to understand my relationship to painting, this idea about influence. Standing on shaky ground, I posed myself for a critical study, but was no longer certain of the questions to be asked. It was clear I was not Manet's type, who I love, and Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me. But it could have been worse. Imagine my fate had de Kooning gotten hold of me. The piece by Robert Colescott, seduced by one another, yet bound by certain social conventions. You framed me and I framed you, but we were both framed by modernism. And even though we knew better, we continued that time-honored tradition of the artist and his model. This idea of complicity is always something that's really interesting to me. How are you complicit? How do you play in your own victimization? There's some really interesting things, being in this women's museum, there's some very interesting things about the way in which women work, how we work, right? So we might be laying out cheese when really, right? Because we're caretakers. And so, we're caretaking and we're trying to run the business. We're trying to wear all of these hats. But at the end of the day, this really jeopardizes us. It puts a strain and a stress on us that's really inappropriate. that we haven't really learned yet how to really negotiate this space of shared responsibility in the way in which we manage and govern our lives. Often when women wind up in corporate positions, they wind up in corporate positions where they are taking care of the men that are the power brokers within those positions. I mean, this is very interesting and true stuff. There's, I've made many different kinds of projects, and today's talk is slightly different because we really wanted to focus a little bit more on this sort of issue of social change, and so I'm not sort of talking about deeply a lot of the other kinds of projects that I typically work on. I'm not going to show any videos or anything like that, but I did want to sort of look at some of the key pieces that I've made over the years, and certainly Kitchen Table is one of those pieces. And then there's a piece like From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. These are all sort of very large pieces for the most part. I work with lots of images, lots of text. Not always, but sometimes with text, with music, with musicians. In fact, my great friend Craig Harris, the amazing composer and musician, is here today because we're working on a new project together. But I work with many different modes. From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried was a project that was commissioned by the J. Paul Getty Museum, and I was the first, actually one of the first living artists that they had ever worked with. It was a very interesting and dynamic and troubled process, but one that has been very interesting and instructive in more ways than one. And I'm only going to show you just a few of these pieces. These are from the Agassiz collection, a body of work that is located at Harvard University. It's where the original images come from. You became a scientific profile, a Negroid's type, an anthropological debate, and a photographic subject. And it was one of those kind of pieces that sparked and raised any number of issues and questions and problems and resolves. And there are a number of people actually who've been writing about it. There were all kinds of things about copyright and appropriation or misappropriation, etc., that really went on around this work. But it was a very important work to do, and I'm really glad I did it. I've been living in the sort of world of color for a long time, and figuring out how to negotiate these sort of questions of color is something that has been ongoing. And maybe one day the slide even might advance. Thank you. So that the sort of palette, I started with, like the Colored People series, and then suddenly, I started thinking about, African jewels and gems, and, the Colored People grid, and these sort of ways of playing with color, where color actually becomes really a world of play, that it's not simply based on sort of this notion of the black and the white, but, color is much more dynamic. It's much more dynamic, it's much more playful, it's much more fraught, than anything that you can really sort of wrap your little mind around. But it's never black and white, right? There's always something really gray, which is why we are having such a difficult time really negotiating the black and white in the United States, because we choose to think of it in binary terms. From Africa, jewels and gems. Where the color becomes, there's this really beautiful saying that within seriousness there's very little room for play, but within play there is tremendous room for seriousness. And so I actually come back to that idea over and over and over and over again, that there is this sort of very important way in which one has to play inside of the work in order to bring out and to bring forward. Can we advance the slide, please? There's sort of ways of sort of, and the way in which these ideas about color are sort of morphing over and through and under a number of bodies of work going back 30 years, right? That I come back to these sort of certain ideas again and again to sort of explore for myself the range of possibility and ideas that relate to sort of notions of color. from the Africa series, an installation at the Museum of Modern Art. At a certain point, again, my work began to tell me a great deal about what I was interested in. I began to understand miraculously that I was really fascinated with architecture. I did not know how much I loved architecture. My work actually told me that I was in love with architecture. And that there's sort of really wonderful ways in which architecture really sort of, impresses itself upon us. That there is something really important about the role of architecture and the way in which we understand male and female relationships, right? The sort of way in which there is a feminine space and that there is male space. And of course, we are always negotiating those spaces, constantly, all day long. What is male space and what is female space, right? And so when I was invited to go to Italy to do the Rome Prize in the mid-2000s, I knew that, of course, I really wanted to do something that was really important around the notion of the architecture, right? I had done very important work in Africa around architecture. I had done very important work in the Sea Islands around architecture. And now I was in Europe doing this piece called Roaming, where I got up every single day and really looked at the architecture of a place and how the body is made to feel in relationship to the architecture, how the female body, the male body is made to feel in relationship to the architecture, the worker in relationship to the state, in relationship to the architecture, gets played out sort of brilliantly in a place like Rome, one of the oldest cities, of course, in the Western world, no? Right? In that place where power, money, right, is invented, and how the individual is made to think of themselves in relationship to the state and the control of the state was absolutely essential. And I thought that it would be really important to sort of experience that very deeply. And so I made hundreds and hundreds of photographs over the course of a year, besides working in Cinecittà in the famous studio where Fellini made his movies. It was really great. I made a piece there called Italian Dreams. This is San Lorenzo, one of the only spaces in Rome that was actually bombed during the war. And then, of course, trying to understand something not only about ancient Rome, the power of ancient Rome, but also the architecture of fascist Rome, of Mussolini's Rome, and its sort of relationship to Nazi Germany, right? The sort of new way in which architecture was making itself felt in relationship to the state and in relationship to the individual and the worker in relationship to the state. I mean, these are really, really important ideas, and it's really sort of interesting that very few people have really written about my work in terms of that, but it's really, really very much at the core of it. And then using this frame, going back to the way in which sort of somebody like, Anna Mandiata sort of uses her body to sort of stand before these spaces, to present herself in the space, in the earth, in the ground, to mark it. And then just as I was sort of finishing up, which is what I was saying, if you can get out of the way, the work will tell you what it is and what it needs. And just as I was finishing up on May Day, 2016, finishing up the Rome series, I found myself in front of the National Museum of Rome. I thought, oh, how fabulous. And so this, sent me, into a whole other space of thinking about the role of the individual in relationship to, of course, the role of museums and the contemporary role of museums. Every museum in the country is asking itself, what is my place now, contemporarily? It will not be what it was in 1960 or 1970 or 1980. It is in a new space that demands a whole other new articulation of possibility, right? If it wants to remain vital and vibrant at a time when we are undergoing sort of profound shift and change. And so, I found myself in front of this museum. I understood immediately what I needed to do. And so I dashed home. I threw some clothes in a bag, a couple of pair of panties, and my black dress and a toothbrush. And I jumped on a plane and I just went throughout Europe, making as many photographs as I possibly could in some of the most important cities that I could get to for my remaining a time. And then, of course, I came to the United States and began photographing museums here in the United States as well. And so this is an ongoing project that I continue to work at and to look at. And of course, this is from the Lincoln Memorial, which is one of my most favorite monuments here in DC. And I've been doing some work now looking at these sort of monuments, the Supreme Court, and the Senate, and so forth, for the organization that I've been working with, FAPE. And as I was sort of thinking about that piece of standing before the memorial, of course, I only could think of Marion and being able to sort of echo her. And so I actually called the piece The Echoes of Marion because I wanted to remember her in relationship to Slow Fade to Black and what we don't hear. What we don't hear, and the ways in which we might not hear with old devices. Other kinds of projects with kids. You know, one of the things that you know, in working on something like constructing history, again, these are large pieces that consist of many, many photographs. But, you know, working with something like constructing history, I realized at a certain point, which is sort of amazing, that one of the reasons, again, that we are at this sort of incredible apex, this sort of brilliant moment and disruptive moment and crazy moment in American politics and policy has to do with all the assassinations that took place in the country, right? Right, that there are all of these assassinations that took place in this country that made it possible for us to actually begin to have these kinds of conversations. And so now, 50 years later, we are now saying that yes, I think we're ready to sit down and maybe deal. And so there was the assassination of Martin and the assassination of the Kennedys and the assassination of Malcolm. When John Kennedy was assassinated, Robert Kennedy called up Hoover and said, "Did you have anything to do with this?" That tells you something about where we were as a country and what he understood was possible in a nation divided. So I looked at all of those things in a piece like Constructing History, trying to understand then how Obama and Hillary Clinton then found themselves for the first time in 2008 facing one another. It was an amazing change, an amazing shift in this country that a black man and a woman could be facing one another, and we knew that one of them was going to win. I mean, this is significant, right? Now, there's other kinds of projects that I've been involved in, and I'm going to try to move through some of this very, very quickly because I know that we have like a conversation that we're going to have in a few minutes. Is this other kind of work that I do. So on the one hand, I spend like a lot of time making the art that I want to make, and I really do work every day. I shouldn't, but I do. And so some of the kinds of projects that I've done, you know, are like this project in Beacon, New York, where I set up a record shop on the main street. It was called the Beacon Project, and I allowed, the piece was to begin to understand the sort of shifting community, a shifting community at a very critical moment when the Dia Foundation was moving into Beacon, New York, and really radically changing what was going on in that community. So that, you know, several years before Dia moved in, you could buy a house for $20,000. After Dia moved in, your house was $200,000, right? I mean, it really sort of changed the nature of the city. And so it was very important to me to begin to sort of collect the materials and the stories that were going on amongst those people who had been living there for a very long time and those people that were moving there for the first time. This sort of shift that was taking place, and to be able to sort of hold that, to record all of that, and then to make this sort of really beautiful packet and to give it to the Historical Society so that the Historical Society itself would have a record of this sort of fundamental change that was taking place made by an artist. And then I invited the next artist that come, and they would do that project for 3 years. Like, you can't do shit like in a year. Everything takes like a really long time, right? You know, it's like you got to put your feet down, you got to, you know, put the money up, and you got to like really, really work hard, and then maybe you get something done. So I started social studies. Social studies is my little organization, and under social studies, I do all of these various kinds of projects, like this project working with Walter Hood for the University of Massachusetts, where, you know, I developed the Hope Peony for W.E.B. Du Bois. I thought that, well, hope should be simply planted in your garden. Just plant it in your garden. If you don't have it in your heart, plant it in your garden, right? And so, you know, so I developed the Hope Peony for Du Bois, and the idea was that it would become the cornerstone for a garden that would happen at the University of Massachusetts. But this peony is available, and I would really be so honored if most of you who are interested in gardening would go out and buy this peony and plant hope in your very own garden. It was really actually a really wonderful way of thinking about social change, sort of these sort of gestures and markers towards change. This very, very simple and very elegant, very unmitigated and easy way. And then there have been times when I've been sort of, you know, a little bit more disruptive. And I took on a persona for a long time where I sold hopes and dreams in a bottle in various neighborhoods. Through a series of performance gestures. Very interested in sort of these sort of ideas of kind of developing my little German Faust. And so now I'm going to go very quickly through this material. I have an organization in Syracuse. It's called the Institute of Sound and Style. And the Institute of Sound and Style was developed for very troubled teenagers in my neighborhood. Syracuse is one of the poorest communities in the country for Blacks and Latinos. In fact, we are the poorest in the country. And so understanding that I was living in this sort of really sort of volatile neighborhood, a lot of things were going on. I was teaching classes actually on art and social change when a young child in my neighborhood was killed. He was 2 years old and he was caught up in gangland violence. His father actually, just 2 days ago, went to jail for another slaying someplace else. This sort of predatory violence that was happening in the neighborhood, in the community, right? And so there was this sort of outcry. I was upset. Everybody I knew was upset. I'm thinking about how do I sort of negotiate this? How do I deal with this as an artist, this sort of crisis that's going on in my community? What are the tools that I can bring forth that might actually make a difference? The first thing that I decided that I was going to do was to develop a series of, I developed a campaign. It was called Project Activate. Oprah came to the neighborhood. It was very troubling. It was a very trying time, very, very, very complex. This is our emblem for the Institute of Sound and Style. We invited teenagers, and one of the important things that we did that I knew would be very, very important, given that I was living in this really poor community, was that the kids not only needed to be trained, they needed to be paid, right? They needed to have this really as kind of a vocational job. And so we brought in a lot of these kids. We introduced them to art, to photography, to music, to recording, to graphic arts and graphic design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I simply figured out for the first year, you know, it's like I sold like a body of work. And I thought, well, this is very cool. I think I'm going to use this body of work in order to pay my kids. And I'll use the next body of work that I sell to pay like the staff that's working with my kids, right? To sort of find a group of people that were really wonderful that could work along with us, to figure out sort of ingenious ways in order to partner with people that were around me, other record studios that were in the neighborhood, producers that were in the neighborhood, teachers that were in the neighborhood, just figuring out, I mean, a lot of this takes a lot of work. I mean, when, I go to bed, I think about it, I get up in the morning and I'm thinking about it. How do I really sort of affect change in this given neighborhood? And how do I pay these kids in a systematic way? And how do I train them in a systematic way? How do I help them sort of realize their own potential that they have to understand that they have? And so I invited in then other people, wonderful writers and poets, to work with my kids. These kids are kids like I am. I'm interested in sex for the most part. Right? I'm interested in sex and clothes. So I sort of figured that, that if I could sort of introduce kids to the thing that they're most interested in, right, that was a way then of sort of cutting through some of the nonsense. And these were wonderful, wonderful kids. One of the things that, were very important about this project, I really don't like kids all that much. But in one way or another, I have to figure out, how to deal with them because I care about them, but I don't like them, And so, so trying to figure out the sort of ways of working with them. And one of the things that they sort of taught me very much about myself was that essentially you simply don't give up on them. Because all day long, these kids they're being shunned by a system that simply doesn't know how to deal with them. And so they're constantly testing you and your own sense of loyalty in relationship to them. The first thing that I did when this violence took place in the neighborhood was to make a series of lawn signs. People came out of their neighborhoods, out of their homes, and assisted me in putting up these signs. And a man doesn't become a man by killing another man, right? Making billboards, making lawn signs, doing matchbook covers, right? Beware of the ultimate cost of violence that it may mean in your life, and taking them to bodegas and bars and having them passed out by the thousands. It was really kind of an amazing project, and some of these signs are still up. My billboard project, the world is watching you fail, your family, your community, and yourselves. Stop the violence. It was very important to have this sort of conversation with the perpetrators of violence. And I couldn't pretend like, yes, I understand like all the bullshit, that we are troubled, but this is predatory and we need to really look at that, right? And so I sort of developed like a whole series of conversations that went on and back and forth between myself, but the perpetrators, and the community itself, and figuring out the sort of ingenious ways in order to make it work. The kinds of signs that I use, the kinds of billboards that I use, so the electronic billboards that we use as opposed to paper billboards so that we could have a sustained narrative in a single place. How do you use the newspaper in strategic ways where you put inserts within the newspaper? Right? We are responsible for the life of our own community, a call to arms for the community. Reclaiming our community is a necessity. Stop the violence. Right? We are responsible, again, for our own community and for the life of our community. Stop the violence. That was important to speak up and to step up and to speak out. That we couldn't play this sort of double standard game, right? You couldn't sort of not want the police when you needed the police and want the police when you didn't want the police, right? I mean, that you had to have a sort of concerted way in which you were negotiating, these ideas. And of course, the idea that one needed to remember to dream. And then building a safe zone and sending out thousands of flyers through my local newspaper. On the one side, it's had a safe zone, and on the other side, there were useful contacts, information that would be useful to you. I mean, these were like really, simple, but they were really, really important strategies. And many of them are still up in windows. Creating a safe place, a safe zone that kids knew that they could go into that space was important. Put this in your window. Put this up as a sign. And this has also been now something that people are using in Harlem as well. Now, I'm going to finish up by just sort of talking very, 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 very briefly about several other really important artists that are doing sort of amazing things for those of you who don't know. And this is very interesting, too. Now, I know a lot of women who are actually doing in some form or fashion, work that is kind of similar to my own, where we are sort of caretakers in a very particular kind of way in relationship to kids, right? We work all very, very hard. We're, very, very dedicated. And then there are the boys. They're the guys who are out here, and they're doing very interesting things as well. There's Rick Lowe and his Project Row House. Project Row House was started maybe 25 years ago. Rick Lowe received a small grant or sold some work, had worked as an architect, and decided that he really wanted to do a whole project in Houston, where he really focused the energy of this area. He built out all of the houses within the 10th Ward, and then he invited, in a very controlled and select way, a group of people to live in this community that had been repurposed and redesigned and redeveloped by him. An absolutely wonderful, wonderful project. Also a really wonderful fine artist. Then there's somebody like Mark Bradford, who has a really brilliant art and practice organization in Los Angeles, one of the first of its kind, right? Where he too has bought up a whole series, through his investment. His mama used to do my hair. His mama's studio used to be around the corner from this place, right? So Mark Bradford, that's my place is just right next door. This is Mark's new space. It's been going now for several years, working with Eileen Norton. They, too, are training young people in their community, doing vocational training, working with psychologists, psychoanalysts even, and urban planners in order to develop this incredible, incredible location. Absolutely beautiful. This area actually was developed by the Olmsted brothers, the sons of the famous Central Park guy. So it's been very interesting to watch these sort of major artists, all of them African American for the most part, who are now doing these kinds of significant projects in their communities and in their neighborhoods, buying up entire blocks of houses, repurposing them, redeveloping them, and thinking about really smart and innovative ways in order to actually really have a major impact in the neighborhoods in which they are located. And the last person is really Theaster Gates, who I think is doing sort of extraordinary work around the country, who's developed a whole series of structures in Dorchester on the south side of Chicago. Amazing, amazing project. And so these sort of ideas of innovation that our artists are involved in, and the sort of relationship of social change that I work with Mark Bradford, that I work with Rick Lowe, that I work with Theaster Gates, all of us working together in order to sort of think about sort of creative ways in which we bring our understanding, our unique vision to the passion and the practice of art as the agency for change. Thank you.